Welcome to History 354 Modern China. In today's lecture video, I want to back up a bit before lunging into the 1960s and the maelstrom that is the Cultural Revolution. Before getting there, we have to touch on a few of the major developments in China's foreign relations over the course of the 1950s and early 1960s. Much of that material was covered in Chapter 20 by Spence, but I want to emphasize China's return to a position of influence on the nations within its orbit in Southeast and East Asia, and then also increasingly in Europe and North America through its rivalry with the United States. One of the central goals of the party in foreign relations in this time was to reclaim China's kind of lost universalistic pretensions as a civilization and society that shaped the values and aspirations of its neighbors and set standards for art, governance, and science in the global community. Much of what Beijing achieved in that aim we can attribute to the work of one man, Zhou Enlai, pictured here on this slide. He was a diplomat that managed to take back China's international respect and use its political clout in Asia despite the radicalism of its domestic agenda and policy set by Mao. By the 1950s, Zhou was the acting foreign minister, an experienced revolutionary who simultaneously enjoyed both the trust and envy of the number one premier, Mao Zedong. More than any other figure of his generation, he was skilled at negotiating, coolly and calmly with hated enemies, probably a trait that he honed during his years during the war against Japan at the nationalist capital in Chongqing. He was incredibly intelligent and well-spoken, elegant in manners, and when deployed to represent China's interests, he was essentially a one-man charm offensive that won the nation friends in Asia and Africa wherever he went. And for that reason, he was feared by the United States and the Eisenhower administration, especially because they constantly tried to undermine his missions to break the American containment ring that they had designed to isolate the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. To break that isolation in the 1950s, Zhou was adept at exploiting the Soviet aid as an opening to strengthening relations with other communist countries, such as nearby Mongolia, who had founded a communist republic in the 1920s, and later in Eastern Europe. Inside China, the Soviet Union developed an enormous program to install an industrial infrastructure that, beyond growth, Soviet planners would use to completely transform China's largest, most populous cities. Classical Chinese architectural principles and designs were ill-suited to the kinds of industrial plants, modern transportation networks, and political tools such as urban squares that were used for class struggle and mass indoctrination that the Soviets required in their urban centers and that were needed by Mao and the Chinese Communist Party. To create those cities then required mass destruction. Much of China's classical heritage in urban areas, its walls, its homes, were leveled and razed, and millions of trees were felled to create modern highways. Imperial palaces and buildings were converted into government offices, used as university campuses, and sometimes even as factories to create things like heavy industry and steel. Beijing, before the Communist Revolution, was a town that was mostly home to scholars, authors, artists, and small-time peddlers in shops and restaurants. They were the families of former courtesans. But in a few generations, the city was thronged with soldiers, factory workers, technicians, students, and political officials. The population ballooned from 1 million in 1949 to over 10 million, and with that came overcrowding, pollution of air and water, and a lot of the kind of tensions concerning crime and corruption that we see in a lot of other urban areas. The Soviet influence was also felt with how China approached the religious and national minorities within its borders, such as the Mongols, the Bai and Koreans in the north, the Uyghurs and Hui Muslims out towards the west, and Tibetans. Many of these people living in the border regions such as Tibet and Xinjiang had been nominally, if not officially, independent in the period from the fall of the Qing until the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Campaigns by the People's Liberation Army in areas such as Tibet in 1950 and 1951 had reestablished Han Chinese supremacy in these areas, with leaders drawn from the local populations recruited to the parties in the 1930s and 1940s to help them solidify their dominance in these regions. Once in power, the CCP adopted the Soviet Union's agenda to use classification, labeling, and governance of these minorities according to Marxist theory, encouraging them in ethnic nationalism. Essentially, they looked at each of these groups with a heavy sense of racial and ideological paternalism. Han Chinese saw many of these religious and national minorities as backwards, quote unquote, and stuck in the past, a past that prevented them from making the leap into becoming good communist citizens and subjects. So instead, like in the Soviet Union, the state encouraged each to industrialize and used growth as kind of an incentive for embracing communist rule. And the development of nationalist institutions such as schools and political organizations so that each of these minorities in the far-off future be ready to join the communist revolution. In many respects, it was a return to the civilizing mission that the Qing had claimed in conquering these areas centuries ago. Whereas the Qing claimed to be acting benevolently toward peoples in areas like Xinjiang by bringing them the teachings of Confucius or the Chinese calendar, now the CCP was doing the same by walking them through the stages of history and industrialization that would eventually produce a communist utopia and equality. At the same time, the CCP was very wary of the potential for ethnic nationalism and local culture to spawn separatist movements. As mentioned, many of these areas like Xinjiang had for a time been in fact independent and their own nation states, if ever so briefly. Like the Soviets then, the CCP began programs to incentivize Han migration into areas like Xinjiang and Tibet, so as to ensure that this region was controlled by Beijing and assimilated into the greater parts of the country. Using Soviet power to solidify its power inside and along its own borders, Zhou Enlai was then equipped to pursue a number of strategic priorities around Asia in the 1950s. His immediate priority was to demonstrate the value of the Soviet investment in China to spread communist revolutions in the region. China's contributions to the Korean War were immense. They suffered the loss of between 600 to 900,000 volunteers in the fighting, and they, after the war, contributed vast amounts of labor and manpower to North Korea's recovery, rebuilding roads and cities. Not long after, China was creating supply lines in Guangxi province to equip Ho Chi Minh in his victory over the French. And later in Geneva, at the peace accords, Zhou Enlai and the CCP proved valuable in forcing the Vietnamese into towing the Soviet line. They convinced them to restrain their operations and withdraw from Laos and Cambodia, and also to cede territory in the south for peace with Western powers like the United States. Zhou ably mediated the interests of the Soviets, the French, the Americans, and the North Vietnamese all at once to find a compromise, and despite the provocations of American John Foster Dulles, he didn't take the bait with this famous snub. Zhou instead diffused the situation, as he often did, with a subtle gesture and humor. As a spokesman then for his party and country, he projected an image of China as pragmatic, peaceful, and cooperative, which countered all the ideas about what was happening inside China as a place of violence, extremism, and fanatical class struggle. It was an image that allowed China to find common ground and principles with nearby new nations, such as non-communist India and Indonesia. India's Jawaharlal Nehru and Indonesia's Sukarno had led their countries in throwing off foreign rule, and they were the architects of a new international coalition of African and Asian nations opposed to colonialism, who were touting the benefits of neutrality in the Cold War. In founding modern diplomatic relations with these nations, Zhou's mission was twofold. At an official level, he and the Chinese Communist Party hoped to break its isolation by the containment circle built by the United States and its allies such as Japan to find networks of trade and cultural ties on friendly terms. Beneath that, though, at an unofficial level, the Chinese Communist Party was committed to world revolution, and so they would sponsor radical leftist movements within these countries that often challenged their own government's authority, equipping them with aid to eventually launch communist revolutions. It was a dangerous line to pursue, since leaders like Nehru might then necessarily view China as undermining their sovereignty and trying to undermine their position in the government. Especially in countries where Chinese formed a large minority population, like Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines, there was the chance that they could be seen as potential fifth columns and disloyal subjects in these new nations. And occasionally, these feelings and fears of Chinese communist influence would produce riots and deadly pogroms in those nations against the Chinese. But for much of the 1950s, Zhou managed to find common ground with countries like India. They shared a common historical experience through the humiliation of colonialism and foreign domination, and together they used that as a platform toward reducing tensions along Tibet and their disputed borders to work toward the building of a unified Asian front under India and China's leadership, with common goals such as non-interference from the outside world and the domestic issues of Asian and African states, and their own path towards development that differed from both the United States and the Soviet Unions. Zhou's partnership with Nehru in India won China an invitation to the coming Bandung Conference in 1955, a summit of world leaders from North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Here, too, Zhou's participation won great admiration and brokered economic and political ties to areas of the world never really formally tied to China in the past. Additionally, Zhou was able to shape the values and ideals of the summit, to talk of peace and cooperation across the Third World, arms reductions, ideas like universal representation in the United Nations, and he managed to manipulate the summit toward neutrality in the Cold War, but one in which the United States was positioned as the greatest threat to world peace and the most aggressive of the two superpowers. By now, this was quite personal. The US had tried to prevent Zhou from even participating in the Bandung Conference by attempting to assassinate him, engineering his plane on the way there to crash, the Kashmir Princess. He survived because he missed his flight, but 16 other Chinese and European communist agents would die. With the US and its allies forming the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, China then managed at Bandung to help create a counterweight with India, Burma, Indonesia, all loosely bound together for mutual protection. Bandung would pave the way for new relations in Africa, where China in the late 1950s and 1960s became a valuable source of foreign funding and expertise for infrastructure projects and support for anti-colonialism throughout the region. At the same time, African students began going on exchanges to study modern education in the People's Republic of China. In contrast to the US and the Soviets, Zhou championed across Africa the idea of non-interference, or a promise to lend aid without demanding political concessions. These relations eventually became marginal to China's agenda in the 1960s and 1970s, but then were revived in the early 21st century and is an important area of international relations today. China is a major donor of aid to African countries and has developed very strong relations with many of these nations, including countries like Uganda and Tanzania. On the eve of the Great Leap Forward, though, Beijing and Zhou Enlai were respected enough in world affairs to actually aid the Soviets with their problems with their allies along the Eastern Bloc in Europe. With uprisings against Soviet domination coming in the wake of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization in Poland and Hungary, Khrushchev actually entreated Zhou to act as an arbitrator between the Soviet Union and its neighbors. The end result was to elevate China, in the theoretical world of Marxism, to a co-equal as leaders in the world communist revolution, a gesture that produced enormous pride inside China. Its revolution was now a driving engine, not just in the fate and destiny of the Chinese people, but the entire world's future. The reality, though, was far different, and Zhou's insistence on behalf of the Chinese that the Soviets should learn from this conflict with Poland and Hungary to reform their bullying of smaller, less powerful states like their satellites was one of just many provocations causing hostility between the two allies. The Soviets grew concerned that the Chinese had mistaken what was intended as a gesture of friendship and goodwill as an actual declaration that leadership in the global movement of communism was actually shared. Fears that were not at all alleviated by Mao's provocative speeches about an east wind rising. He seemed brash and insolent in criticizing the Soviets' search for a means of peaceful resolution to the Cold War in coexistence with the United States, or at times a downright lunatic to the Soviets and talking optimistically about winning a nuclear showdown with the West. Okay, I have just like 5 more minutes, which I'm going to finish in the next video.